Okay, hi Barbara, we're starting the class now. Let's bring up the page. Okay, so we're learning the Rebbes talk on Shabbos Parshas Boy, and that year was Dalid Shvat, the 4th of the month of Shvat. Now today we're the 2nd of Shvat, so Shabbos will be the 3rd this year. And it was also Parshas Boy, of course, that year. So the Rebbe says like this: In Yonam Yuchid Shal Parshas Boy, what is unique about Parshas Boy, biyachas l'shara parshas, with regard to the other portions of the Torah, Hashachas l'tzias Mitzrayim, that discuss the Jewish people leaving Egypt, meaning Shemois ve'era and Meshalach. So there's 4 parshas that deal, 4 sections of the Torah, 4 readings of the Torah that deal with the Jewish people leaving Mitzrayim, starting from Shemos ve'era, this week's parsha, which is Boy, and then the week Meshalach. So what's unique about Boy versus Shmos ve'era Meshalach? So the Rebbe says, Shebeshara parshas meduber oides ha'achana l'tzias Mitzrayim. The first 2 parshas were talking about the preparation for leaving Egypt. Shmos ve'era, the first 2 parshas talk about the Jewish people going to Egypt, Moshe being appointed the Redeemer, etc. And things that happened after they left Egypt. Starting on top of page 271. So the next week's parsha is talking about after the Jewish people left Egypt. The first 2 parshas that deal with the leaving of Egypt is the preparation for leaving Egypt. This week's parsha is unique versus all the other parshas. In this week's parsha, we actually leave Egypt. That says to be more specific. Gamas Chos Parsha, even this week's Parsha, Lefnei HaYitzia Mitzrayim, before we left Egypt, Sheitzarech V'Shalish Shmakas Neisefes, Ad Shepari Hiskim L'Shalachas B'nei Yisrael. In this week's Parsha, in the beginning of the Parsha, we learn about the last 3 plagues that Pharaoh had, that God inflicted on Pharaoh before he agreed to let the Jewish people go. With Geshes HaYitzia B'Mitzrayim Yoisem Parsha Shlefneiza, we already start to see, even in the plagues, even before Pharaoh actually told Moshe in the 6th reading to leave Egypt, we already find that there's a difference in this week's parsha. Where do we see the difference? Sha'avdei Parei, the servants of Parei, means the ministers, etc. Amru, they're already saying, Kfar shalach es hanoshim v'yavdus Hashem alekehem. In this week's parsha, we find already in the last 3 plagues, the servants are telling Pharaoh, enough's enough. What's this obsession? Just let them go. I mean, Egypt is going to be totally destroyed. We also find other things in this week's parsha that is part of the Jewish people's preparation for leaving Egypt. The things that the Jewish people did with getting ready for leaving Mitzrayim. Like it says, Daber na, please speak ba'aznei to the people. V'yishalu ish me'esra'eyo v'isha me'esra'usa klichesav v'klizav, that the men and the women should borrow from their male and female neighbors in Egypt, silver and gold. And v'yiten Hashem eschena ve'enei Mitzrayim, and God's going to give the grace of the people, meaning the Jewish people, in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they're going to loan them their gold, silver, and expensive things. To fulfill the vow that God made to Avram, that after being enslaved by the Egyptians, who enslaved them, all of them included, so they were going to give them the lefachot, at least to leave with gold and silver, to leave as very wealthy, so they shouldn't leave as slaves or poor people. And then we learn also about the details of the sacrifice of the Pesach. The fact that God commanded, and then that fact that the Jewish people did. And the fact that he ate the Korban Pesach on the special night, the night of the watchful night, which was the night when the plague of the firstborn was. And that was all part of leaving and getting ready to leave Egypt. And they were eating it in a way where they were all garbed up, ready to go out of Egypt, ready for the way. So there's all. In this week's parsha, basically the Rebbe is saying there's a certain urgency, both in the Egyptians to get the Jews out, the Israelis out, the Israelites out, and from the Bnei Israel to get ready to leave, and the commandments getting ready to leave. So again, the point that Rebbes is making is there's a certain urgency, there's a uniqueness in Parshas Boy with regard to the Jewish people leaving Eretz Mitzrayim. Even more so. In this week's parsha, we actually learn the verses that talk about the Jewish people leaving Egypt. They left first from the area called Ramses, and from there they went to the place called Sukkah. And the verse says, like we read today on the sixth reading, that it was in the middle of the day, in the essence of the day, all the hosts of the Jewish people left Egypt. Again, he's quoting the different verses of the Jewish people leaving Egypt. So too, at the end of the parsha, we learn at the end of the parsha, the seventh reading of the parsha goes on about the laws of the firstborn that is connected to the leaving of Egypt. And over there also we learn about the mitzvah, one of the sources of the mitzvah of tefillin. And part of the mitzvah of tefillin is to remember the leaving of Egypt. Mentioned both, hey Aaron, is mentioned both in the scripture of tefillin, etc. Remember this day that you left Egypt. This will be a sign on your arm, and a memory between your eyes. Part of the putting on tefillin is to remember that with a strong hand God took us out of Egypt. You see, that the leaving of Egypt itself is a sign. You should put them the parts that deal with leaving Egypt in the tefillin. That's the four parshas, the four sections, and you wrap it on your arm and on your head. So all this is about, we see that the entire parsha is about leaving Egypt at a certain level of urgency that we didn't see in the first parshas and even don't see in the next parsha, which deals with the splitting of the Red Sea. The Rebbe is wants to, of course, lead up to something. So now, if the whole parsha is really talking about leaving Egypt, how do we connect that with the name of the parsha? Kiyadua, as is known, that Sheshema parsha Moira al Teichna parsha Kula. The name of the parsha gives us insight of to what is the tochen, what is the message of the parsha. And the Rebbe teaches us this in every parsha. When there's a name of a parsha, the name, we have to look at the name, analyze the name to understand the message. And what's this week's parsha? How does it start? Boyal Pari, come to Pharaoh. Boyal Pari Madgish, when you say come to Pharaoh, Pharaoh is the king, and he's still the king, the ruler, the decision maker. So the Rebbe says, Madgish Ataikif to Pari. It still shows the strength of Pari. Pari is the one that Moshe has to go to. Moshe still needed Pharaoh. He has to go to him. And to warn him. How much longer are you going to hold back from letting the Jewish people out? But he needs Pari to agree. If you're not going to, if you're going to continue to not to hold the Jewish people back from leaving, then you're going to have the seventh plague, or the seventh plague, eighth plague. Sorry. Rashi says, how long are you going to wait? He says that the translation is, as the Targum Onkelos says, the ischana. How long are you going to wait till Lizchana means the word kniya, to submit, to be like the word also ani, poor in the way of shafel? When are you going to lower yourself to Moshe? But that means he hasn't lowered himself yet to Moshe. That means God is talking not to Moshe, but to God. Moshe is telling Pharaoh, when are you going to submit? When are you going to lower yourself? When are you going to humble yourself? I.e., while he's talking to him, he has not yet submitted. He has not yet humbled himself. Meaning to say that we're talking about the strength of Pharaoh. God is waiting for him to, why are you holding back from humbling yourself before God? So the beginning of the parsha starts Boa Paroi. When we say come to Paroi, we're still talking about the strength of Paroi. It means Moshe is trying to submit him, but he hasn't yet done it. It's Tzarech Lavan, we have to understand. Ma'awa Tam, what is the reason? Shaparsha. If the whole parsha is talking about leaving Egypt, we're talking about the Yitzis Mitzrayim. Shetoichna Yitzim Mitzrayim, that we're leaving the limitations of Egypt. Idei Ashvir de Mitzrayim, through breaking Egypt. Hatoichin the Eser Makos, that was the whole point of the 10 plagues, was to break Egypt. Hanikras b'shem boy al Pari. Why is this week's parsha called "Come to Paroi"? Shemadgish take it to Mitzrayim. They were talking about the strength of Egypt. So if the real point of the parsha, if one analyzes, is the redemption, but the name of the parsha, we're still talking about the strength of Paroi. To put it in other words, L'chura haisa chalukas haparsha stricha liya is ba'ifin shaitzim Mitzrayim tiya parsha b'fnei atzmai. The Rebbe is asking the obvious question: why can we just finish last week's parsha after the 10 plagues and start this week's parsha with Pharaoh telling the Jewish people leave? That would make sense that we start the parsha with the exodus of Egypt. Klaimar shegim l'makas achron is the last 3 plagues. Yiv parsha shilfnei that should be in last week's parsha, min ve'era. V'yachnim shar makas together with the other 7 plagues. Parsha shlachar said, when's the next parsha start? Taschel should begin by hachonis the bnei Yisrael yitzis Mitzrayim. Start with the preparations for leaving Egypt. We shouldn't start the parsha and name the parsha after we're still talking about the strength of Paroi. And we should talk about the actual leaving of Egypt. What's the reason? The chalukas of parshas. And when the parshas were divided, they were divided in such a way. That even in the parsha that we talk about, in the Torah portion that we talk about the leaving of Egypt, we're still talking about the need to break the strength of Paroi, i.e. Paroi is still strong. Ba'al Paroi, come to Paroi. V'hisra bai, warn him. Hemshech v'sim hamakis, the last 3 of the plagues. Not only that, not just that we're talking about it in the beginning of the parsha, but that's the name of the parsha. The Rebbe says to emphasize even stronger. When it comes to talk about the end of the parsha, I mean the 7th reading, when it talks about the obligation, the mitzvah of putting on film. So it says the parsha's tefillin chsiv, in the parsha it says like this: when God's going to bring us to the land of the Canaanites, so Rashi says on the parsha, there are those of our rabbis, hey Ariel, there are those of our rabbis, that when did they start sanctifying the firstborn? Only the firstborn that were born in Eretz Yisrael, not the ones that were born in the desert. Obviously, the Jewish people are having kids still in the desert. Those were not considered. They weren't sanctified firstborn, because the verse says, when you come to the land. So Rashi says, and according to the opinions, the rabbis who say that they did sanctify the firstborn even in the desert, they explained, that why does God say when you come to the land? Why are we talking about the land if they were sanctifying the firstborn already in the desert? Because God was telling the Jewish people through Moshe that if you're going to keep the mitzvah, the commandment of the firstborn, that itself will merit you to enter the land. Okay, so Rashi brings 2 opinions. One opinion is that they did not have the obligation to sanctify the firstborn in the desert, and the second, that even if they did, that was a condition or help that they should merit to go into the land. So too about the obligation to make tefillin. Obviously, to make tefillin in the desert would have been a big challenge. According to the opinions, based on the same verse that talks about when you come to the land. We know that whenever the Torah talks about it's connected to a mitzvah. From there, a lot of opinions hold that the mitzvah only starts when you enter the land, like the mitzvah of the pouring of the wines, etc., the nesachim. So here it says there are opinions that say that the Jewish people did not have the mitzvah of wearing tefillin in the desert. The mitzvah of tefillin only started when they entered the land. It's not everyone's opinion. And the other opinions that hold that they did have the obligation and they did wear tefillin in the desert. When was the main mitzvah? Everyone agrees that the main mitzvah is because the Torah says, when you come to the land. Same idea like Rashi says. Why did they do it in the desert? So they should merit to be able to do when they come to Eretz Yisrael. But the main idea is for them to do it when, again, whenever the Torah says when you come to the land, means to say that the mitzvah that's been commanded now is basically
Marriage. What date? She's done.
yes, and hold on. Let me just finish my thought a second. Let me finish the paragraph. So therefore, that that in order for them to do the mitzvah in the desert, they in Eretz Yisrael, they did it in the desert to prepare for that. Darshas Chazal, as our rabbis have said, be it the kasev Rachman Gabi Tefillin upetach hamar mibaylei liktetanya devei Rabbi Shmuel asay mitzvah zush b'shvil dekanis laretz. Again, like he quotes that Rabbi Shmuel says, why do we have the mitzvah of tefillin and the firstborn? Is so you should do the mitzvah so you should merit to enter the land. Shazi hakim the mitzvah tefillin b'shleimus, and then you could do tefillin in its completion. Yes, Aaron.
My my understanding of those two mitzvahs is that we live all over the world and we're commanded to do it. So why wouldn't they be commanded to do it? Because they're not in the land.
Certain mitzvahs, you're right. It's a good question. It's a good question because some of the mitzvahs that it talks about the land are mitzvahs that are only connected to the land. And once the Jewish people exiled, those mitzvahs are no longer at least biblical. They're only rabbinic, if at all. Good, excellent question. But when it comes to mitzvahs tefillin, because it's not connected specifically to the Beis Hamikdash or really to the land as a mitzvah that's part of the land itself. It's just when you enter the land, once they got the mitzvah, then the mitzvah remained. But the question is, when did the mitzvah really kind of cement in as being a total obligation when they entered the land? But it's an excellent question that you're asking. Let's continue. Kloimar. Simu Gmar Pashas that seems to try. What's the Rebbe's point over here? What's the Rebbe trying to tell us? So the Rebbe says that the completion of leaving Egypt, which is what we talk about, at the end of the parsha, that how do you complete leaving Egypt, which is an idea that the Rebbe talked about all the years about Egypt. Leaving Egypt is just the first step. The idea is to go to the land of plenty, the land of Eretz Yisrael. So how do we complete leaving Egypt is by tefillin, which is connected to entering the land. It means even the Rebbe quotes two opinions. Either they didn't put on tefillin in the desert, or if they put on tefillin in the desert, it was all about a preparation of entering the land. Kivan, shakavon v'tachzis Mitzrayim. What's the point? The whole idea of leaving Egypt, hiaknisa laaretz, is to enter the land. It means we didn't just leave Egypt to leave Egypt. We left Egypt to enter the land. The promise to Avram when Lech Lecha wasn't that go to the land because you're going to leave Egypt, or he was promised that his children are going to go into exile and they're going to leave that exile. But the reward or the promise or what defined the whole experience that we know of Avram was about the land. It wasn't about leaving Egypt. Leaving Egypt was just a byproduct to get to the land, to be worthy to get to the land, to be able to accomplish what we need when we get to the land. So he says the whole idea, the whole point of leaving Egypt is not just leave Egypt, it's to enter the land. I'm going to take you out of the poverty of Egypt, to the land of Canaan. The land of flowing milk and honey. I'm going to take you out of the the torture, so to say, and the difficulties of Egypt. I'm going to bring you to the land. Someone needs to understand. The very fact that we leave Egypt and boy. Go again, even though the main message of the parsha is to leave Egypt. Although the name of the parsha, we're still talking about the strength of Pharaoh. The leaving of Egypt itself is only the first phase of leaving Egypt. That we go from Ramses to Sukkot. And as we continue to go from Sukkot onwards in the next parsha, in the next week's parsha we talk about in what way God did not take them. He didn't take them through the land of the Plishtim, what would be today Aza. That would be to a direct way. And if they saw a battle, they would go. If they went on a direct way, they would run back to Egypt. Means even after they left Egypt, we see already in last week's parsha, there's still the concern that they would leave Egypt, and that it was possible they would go back to Egypt. V'gemar Yitzim Mitzrayim he b'Kriyas Yamsuf. When did they totally leave Egypt? When they split the Red Sea. Kishvayar Yisrael Mitzrayim Esav Sasiyam. When they finally saw the Egyptians dead by the banks of the river. Shaz Batla Emes Mitzrayim B'nei Israel. Only then did they stop fearing Egypt. So what's the Rebbe's question with that? V'tzarach bir, we need to understand. Ma'atam shemitzvahs tefillin hakshurim hakavana v'tachlis tachlis hashlemis tzis Mitzrayim b'chnis la'aretz. Why does the mitzvah of tefillin, which is connected to the completion of the whole story of Egypt, i.e. entering the land, nichtava miyad la'achar shlav rishon, why do we write about it when we still didn't finish leaving Egypt? So the Rebbe is saying, the Rebbe has two questions here. The Rebbe's question is on the beginning of the parsha and the end of the parsha. The beginning of the parsha should have been connected to last week's parsha, where we're still talking about the plagues. We're still talking about the strength of Pharaoh. And this week's parsha should start with the Exodus of Egypt, where the mitzvah is connected to the Exodus of Egypt. And then when we talk about the end of the parsha of Tefillin, and the whole point of the Tefillin is the idea of entering the land. Entering the land is the last stage of leaving Egypt. So, and we were still in the middle of that stage until after the splitting of the Red Sea, where the Jewish people were concerned, and there was a concern the Jewish people want to go back to Egypt. So the mitzvah of Tefillin should have been at least after the splitting of the Red Sea, when we totally left Egypt. Then you can start talking about the next stage of going into Canaan. Why are we talking about going to Canaan, to Eretz Yisrael, when we're still in the middle of trying to figure out how to leave Egypt? Okay, so the question is about the beginning and the end of the parsha. Why do we learn about the mitzvah of tefillin, which is about entering the land, before we completed the leaving of Egypt, which we completed in the splitting of the Red Sea in next week's parsha? At the same time, the parsha that has tefillin, which is the end of leaving Egypt and because it talks about entering the land, is part of a parsha that not only talks about the beginning of Egypt, it talks about the strength of Pharaoh. So seemingly there's a contradiction, not just two questions, but it's a single question. The beginning of the parsha talks about the strength of Pharaoh, i.e. this Jewish people are slaves. That's the strength of parsha. Moshe needs Pharaoh to submit. And then the parsha talks about way ahead, about a certain freedom. From here we see what the Rebbe is basically getting at. The Rebbe is tying in the idea of redemption in the time of Galus, right? That there's not this when you walk it out slowly, finish things, close the door on Galus before you open the door on Geula. So that would be if we finished Parshas Ve'era with the plagues, and you opened up a new door to a new Parsha of Boi. And same thing, we would go to the next section of entering the land at a later point, talk about the film when we completed the leaving. The very fact that it's one big chant, one big mix of Galus and Geula together, this was one of the themes that I spoke about, especially in these years, 1991. To explain this, we first need to explain Divrei HaZohar. The Zohar says, there's a famous question the Rebbe talked about many years. But the Zohar says, it says Boal Pare. Machsiv Boal Pare. Why does it say come to Pare? The translation boy means come. Lech al Pare boy. It should have said go to Pare. Why come to Pare? My boy. El da ayale kodesh baruch hu adirin baser adirin legabe tenina chada Allah tekifa the kam dargim shtals leminei. Uman ihu raza the tanin hagadol. Umoishe the chal minei leikar ve'el legabe inun ye'oyrin ve'inun deragin lei. So he's saying that the Zohar says that this great sea monster, which is referring to Parai, was a great power. And Moshe was basically scared of this power. Moshe had a fear of the strength of Parai. Even the Chama Kadosh Baruch Hu did Dachel Moshe. When God saw that Moshe was concerned, he was scared of Parai. Parai was strong. Again, the beginning of Parashah talks about, last week's Parashah in Haftorah, talked about Tanin HaGadol, the great sea monster. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, so God tells Moshe, Hinini alecha pari melch Mitzrayim atan hagadol arevitz b'toichi arav. God says and he's talking about the power of the king of Egypt. Although this is part of the prophecy of Yirmiyahu, 1,000 years later, 800 years later, the Tan Hagadol, the great sea monster. Because God had to force Moshe to come with him. He had to take Moshe with him to Paro. Moshe, basically, the Zohar says Moshe was scared of Paro. Paro had represented tremendous strength. We're not talking about physical strength, but spiritual strength. So the Rebbe explains, Klomer, Pari Husharish Makra Klipos. Pari represents the forces of evil, the Klipos, which is the forces of evil. Hatanin Hagadol, the great sea monster. How strong was Paro's strength of tuma, of impurity? To the extent Moshe was scared of the strength of the impurities of Paro. God couldn't tell him, just go to Paro. El Pari, i.e., you go yourself. El Pari, God had to go with Moshe, because Moshe was scared to go to Pari alone. That God Himself went with Moshe to Pari. And God takes him in with him. So God could fight, and Moshe should have the strength to battle with him. In order to nullify him. Meaning, so here we see that the reason why the verse opens up, come to Pari, is because Moshe was scared to go to Pari. So again, we're talking about the strength of Pari. This is the Zohar says. Why does the Zohar say this in the beginning of the eighth plague? There's other times it says Boil Pari, come to Pari. In the earlier parsha, in the earlier sections, why does the Zohar wait until our parsha to talk about that God needed to encourage Moshe and go with Moshe to Pari, not to send him to Pari as if Moshe was alone? In the beginning in Va'era, when God said, come to Pari, it's talking about this, Moshe was going to speak to Pari. Go to Pari and speak to him. Go to Pari and say so to him. In our parsha it says, that in the other times when God said to Moshe, come to Paro, there was come and say something. There was a very isolated, there was a very exact mission for that time. Here the Torah just says, come to Pari. It doesn't say after to say anything specifically to him. That's all the Torah says. Come to Pari. So what's the Zohar say? The Zohar saying, why does the Torah say that? There's no continuation to that mission. Although it's part of a greater mission, but in the specific, why doesn't it continue? Love. So the Zohar explains. The Baal Pari that Baal Pari is its own whole section. The Ayale Kuchabricho Adin Basi Adin Lagabatinina Lagacha Bekrevadem. God just had to go with Moshe to this last final battle with Pari. Baal Pari Bishvil Lifal by Shvir Sabitel, because now we're starting to break Pari. Up until now, we were talking to Pari. Now starts the breaking of Pari, the Shvira. Shvira is the breaking, Bittel is the nullification. For them to see my wonders. You're going to start seeing the wonders and the miracles that I do to Egypt. And there's obviously a lot of footnotes to explain the nuances of this idea. God had to go chamber into chamber. Where do you destroy Paro's strength? Where he's settled, where he's established. You have to go into his chambers, into his inner chambers, and destroy all his places of strength. The other times he went and met him by the Nile, he met him over here. Now it's time to break him. It's not to give him a message. Until now, we were giving him a message. Now it's time to actually break him. Break him, you have to go inside, all the way inside to his most secure place. He must go to his house. To the palace of the king. And in the palace of the king, in the inner chambers. Like the Zohar says, chamber within a chamber. Within the palace. That's where he really lives. You have to go to his most private, secure place. That's where his strength is. And when we break and nullify Parai, in his palace, in his chambers, in the most inner chambers. Only then you can break his strength. You can't break his strength when he's outside. You have to break it from within. That's where his essence is. Then everything else falls apart. When do you destroy Parai? If you destroy the core of Parai, then all the byproducts of Parai fall apart. you can try to hit him in certain points, certain external exposures, that's not going to deal with the problem. So you're just going to bruise him. If you want to destroy power, you have to destroy Meta's core. And therefore, God had to tell Moshe, the Zohar says, come with me. I'm going to come with you. He didn't say, go on your own. And we see this in the final plague, the plague of the firstborn. It says, Vayakim Pari Laila, but like Rashi says, Pari himself woke up in the middle of the night. He had to change his whole being. Kings usually wake up 3 hours into the day. And Pari woke up in the middle of the night. Him, he and all his servants. And Rashi says, first him and then his servants. It's Pari woke up all his servants and said, Chaver, get up. Means until that point, his servants were trying to pressure Pari. Now Pari himself is in panic. The famous Rashis that Pari ran in the streets saying, "Where's Moshe? Where's Aaron? Where do they live?" He didn't know where they lived. Please leave. From here we see that all of a sudden the strength, even in the most secure place of Pari, when he was in his inner chambers, that's where he was sleeping. In his palace. He no longer had his strength. He was totally broken. He himself had to run around from place to place. He had to wake up his servants. He's running around. In Israel, there's a song, Pari pajamas b'toch halayla. Pari is running around Egypt in his pajamas. By him losing himself, totally falling apart, it means his whole strength falls apart. As the Torah continues, what does he say when he tells the Jewish people to leave? Pray for me. Pray that I shouldn't die. He totally lost his strength. He had known that he felt totally dependent on Moshe. Therefore, the Torah needed to first emphasize the strength of Pari for us to understand the breaking of Pari. You can't understand what's been accomplished with the breaking and nullification if we don't first establish the strength of Pari. Where is the real breaking and nullification? To break him in a side point. Not sure what that sound is. To break him in a side point, that's not enough. They actually had to break him in the essence and the strength of Pari. When Nekudas Ha'inyan, he says, what is the point over here? When the beginning of the parsha, though we talk about the strength of Pari, we start talking about we talk about the strength only to understand the breaking of Pari. We have to go to the strongest point of Pari. Talk about that, the place where Moshe is most scared to go to, and say now starts the breaking point. We're breaking Pari at his core. The idea of going to Pari in the beginning of the parsha is not just for the outcome, that we should be able to leave Egypt. Like the over here, the going to Pari started not just for go to Pari so you could accomplish the exodus of Egypt, but now we're going to Pari to break Pari. It's a new mission. The this is a battle on its own, without a mission in order for something to achieve something else. The mission is breaking Pari. And this idea that we're breaking Pari as its own mission, not just that we should be able to take the Jewish people out of Egypt, meaning to say, what is the difference? If we're saying that the main goal is to leave Egypt, so if we could leave Egypt without breaking Pari, hypothetically, that's fine. We're not looking to break Pari, to destroy the evil of Pari, to destroy the tumah of Pari, the impurity of Pari. We're looking to leave Egypt. So if we're looking to leave Egypt, as long as we could achieve leaving Egypt, that's our goal. Here the Torah says, then this is the Zohar is teaching us. Why is Moshe scared? Because the mission is different. The mission is not about leaving Egypt. The mission is about destroying Pari, destroying the impurity of Pari. Because if you don't understand the mission, if it's just about leaving Egypt, then the question asks itself, why are you in Egypt in the first place? It means if you just don't want to be here without achieving anything, so why are we here in the first place? Obviously, we're here for a purpose, and part of that and that purpose had to actualize itself with Moshe destroying Pari. And that's part of leaving Egypt. And therefore, in the beginning, when we talk about leaving Egypt, we must emphasize and talk about this the destruction of the impurity of the Tanin Hagad, of the big sea monster, which is Pari, like Yirmiyahu calls him. Okay, so the Rebbe establishes the fact that what is leaving Egypt? Leaving Egypt includes, and the main idea of leaving Egypt is that we identify the strength of Pari, which explains why we're here in the first place. Israel, the Jewish people had to fight the impurities that were in Egypt. A large majority of the sparks that fell into the clutches of impurity were in Egypt, 210 of the 288. And therefore, in order to complete the mission of why they were in Egypt in the first place, they had to break Pari. The Rebbe says to explain this. We'll go a little further, because we want to get at least to some part of the answer. You have to remember something. If we go back to the beginning of the conversations God has with Moshe, with Avram, right? What's God's conversation with Avram? Leave your parents' home. Leave the comfort of your space, because I'm giving you the land. And then there was the promise of the children, the promise of the land. So there's the real conversation between Avram and God is about the land. Egypt is kind of part of the Bris Ben Absarim, the covenant that seems like it shouldn't have a direct connection. But the main goal here is to enter the land, about entering the land. Commotion is bar, like it says, Avram Avinu Bris Ben Absarim. That no, Kiger years at first your children are going to be foreigners in a land that's not theirs. They're going to be enslaved for 400 years. I will judge the nation that tortures them. And after that, and the fourth generation comes back to Eretz Yisrael. So the whole point over here is the end game is getting to Eretz Yisrael. I gave this land to your children. But so the point is, what's the connection between Golus Mitzrayim, the exile of Egypt, and entering the land, which seems to be the goal? It means there's Baruch where Hashem wanted. Yes, the goal is to enter the land. The goal is to inherit the land. But in order to inherit the land in a way that it's not a gift, but it's through avodah. We know that in Chassidus emphasizes that the main idea of creation is avodah. There's no freedom to get things handed out for free. That's in Egypt. Eretz Yisrael comes with avodah. It's nikna b'yisurim, right? So it says that God wanted that the Jewish people should inherit the land through the avodah b'koyach atzmam on their own. They shouldn't have the land as a free handout. Hainu Yisrael yasu eretz miloshin artzis shetia Eretz Yisrael. This is the Rebbes introducing this idea of machta Eretz Yisrael. God wanted that we should take artzios. The word eretz, Chassidus explains from the Baal Shem Tov, is also from the place ratzon. We should take the wants of the mundane and turn it into the wants to the land of Eretz Yisrael, of godliness. Eretz shiratz lasis r'tzayin koina, a land that wants to do the will of its creator. Eretz Yisrael Shenikar ba shaychus el Yisrael. Eretz Yisrael is identified as a land of the Jewish people. A land of the Jewish people means the land of God. You, the Jewish people, are going to be a subject, a land of desire. The inner eye of God. Therefore, God is watching over Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, from the beginning and the end of the year constantly, because the land of Eretz Yisrael represents the desire to do what Hashem wants by the nation who wants to connect themselves to Hashem. What does it mean, Eretz Yisrael? What does it mean to make it a godly land? That we should see godliness in the mundane. The Eretz, which represents mundane, should be Yisrael. Should be a place that God looks at because we see. The seeing, the visual, is not just one way. God sees Eretz Yisrael, and we see godliness through the land. Like it says, see godliness through your own flesh. And this is the Rebbe's idea that the Rebbe would talk about. It's based on a Talmud that we're going to see in a second, that the Eretz Yisrael should spread to all the nations. Chazal, as it says from the rabbis, Asida Eretz Yisrael should dispash b'chol artzois. Israel, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Eretz Yisrael, is going to, in the days of Mashiach, spread to all the lands of the world. What does it mean? It means that there's not going to be a place in the world that's not permeated by godliness, that there's not going to be a visual of godliness. In the whole world, in the entire world, we're going to see the power, the power of the action in the thing that's being in the object that he's working in. So to say, God's handiwork is in the world. We're going to see that there's God's handiwork in the world, that God created the world. What's the idea of Eretz Yisrael? Eretz Yisrael is a land that does the want of its creator. Where we see there's a visual connection between the mundane and the spiritual, and that idea has to spread through the whole world. As it says, that in the days of Mashiach there's going to be revelation, and everyone's going to see. It's going to be such a level of visual in that the Yesh HaNivra, the entity of creation or the created, is going to see that it's really one with the creator, with the true Yesh, with the true something. Which is referring to godliness. And how do the Jewish people earn? That's not a handout, that they earn Eretz Yisrael. They earn the idea of living in the land of revelation, the land of the plenty. What defines plenty? Revelation. Where there's a revelation of godliness. What's the idea? You have to go through Galus in order to earn it, and not to just be handed it. You have to first be in a nation that's not yours. Eretz lo lahem. What does it mean, a land that's not yours? Eretz she'eina sheyachas l'Yisrael, a land that's not on its own connected to the Jewish people. What does that mean? That's the land that the mundane dictates the narrative. V'yisayim is Eretz sheminagedes l'Yisrael, not just the land that's not openly godliness, but the land is screaming anti-God, against godliness, against Israel. Eretz Mitzrayim, it's the land of Egypt. Hashem Shimei Tzira Yisrael, it's a land that causes restrictions on the Jewish people and what the Jewish people represent, which is the revelation of godliness. The Yosei Eretz Aretz is the most low place in the world, morally. Mekukolim Mikolomus, the Egyptians were the most corrupt of all the nations. The lowest of the low. Ve'af became, nevertheless, Gambri Dasim Eretz Mitzrayim, the Jewish people went there, like Moshe had to go into Pharaoh's inner chamber. Like the Rebbe spoke that year, was very into the idea of Vechi Yaakov. Yaakov lives in Mitzrayim. We don't get overwhelmed by the restrictions. Our job is to light up the darkness. Chaim Amitim, the Yaakov, where does Yaakov really live? In Mitzrayim. There he really shines, because he's able to be effective in Mitzrayim. The Rebbe says more than that. It's not just that you survive in Egypt, but you affect Egypt. You elevate Egypt. What's the two general ideas of elevating Egypt? He says, first is to take out the holy sparks. Everywhere there has to be holy sparks, otherwise it wouldn't exist. Like it says, the converts, the multiple nations of converts that left with the Jewish people represent the sparks. We know the idea, the Or Chaim teaches about the idea of the sparks within every convert is a spark that gets brought back to its roots. Not just in the people, but also in the material things. Like it says, the very fact that the Jewish people took the silver and gold and the clothing, Rashi says the clothing was the most important, was because in those articles there's sparks. Otherwise, again, they wouldn't exist. To elevate, to make those articles of holiness. They saved Egypt. Like a place that has no grain or has no fish, right? If you have a fishing pool with no fish, it's not a fishing pool anymore. Shvira. So one thing is to elevate, birur. The second point of going to Egypt is Shviro bitul danyanim habilti ritzuim she'ef shelevarim ulaloisim lekdusha. we know that there's two ideas. There's the idea of birur, to refine, to elevate, to engage. There's the avoda, there's the work of engagement, and engagement means you elevate the thing that you're engaging in, person, idea, or thing, or article. And then there's the idea of breaking, the nisyonis. Nisyonis is things that you can't elevate. They're so rooted in darkness that the only way to fix them is through breaking them. Shvirasan zutakanasam. The way you fix them is to break them. You know that law applies to certain vessels that become impure. The only way for them to become pure again is if they're broken, they lose their identity as a vessel. Hold on, Aaron. Vishvirasan zuhi tarasan. How do you make them pure? Is by breaking them. It means the idea is not to break them as in just to destroy something. The destruction of it is its elevation. It loses its identity. That's why there's certain pots that when you break them, they're no longer pots. So therefore, they have the ability to become pure again. Not only that, not only do they get broken, and that's their purity, it adds to the greater total of holiness. It says that it talks about the tzur. Tzur today, I think, is somewhere in Lebanon and Jerusalem. Either Tzor stands or Jerusalem stands. They can't both stand. If Tzor stands, Jerusalem falls. If Jerusalem stands, Tzor falls. So therefore, they're saying breaking Egypt strengthens Eretz Yisrael. When did Tzor become a city? Only when Jerusalem was destroyed. So to the contrary, the opposite. When Tzor gets destroyed, he tights if it adds in the completeness, shleimus, the Yerushalayim. Because this shows the strength of holiness, that it doesn't allow for anything impure to exist. There's no opposition. Totally gets nullified. Again, the Rebbe is always taught the belief destruction doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Destruction means you break its entity. It doesn't exist as a metzius, it loses its identity. You break the vessel that gives it the ability to become pure. Yes, Aaron.
Okay. Okay, two questions. How do you break?
You're very muffled. Go ahead.
Okay. How do you break? Am I muffled now?
Continue. Let's see.
How do you break something like you were just talking about, and how do you take the mundane and bring it up in this world to holiness?
Two different things. So, Brad, just we have to finish in a minute. So, just the breaking of let's go first to the second question. To engage, to elevate is when you take something mundane that's not nor kosher or non-kosher, and you turn it becomes a tool of holiness. Meaning, food, you use the energy of the food to serve God, or to do an act of kindness, right? If you could use energy, everyone needs energy. So if you eat and then you do something bad, so you're using the energy, you're bringing the food down. But if you eat and do something good, you pray, you do acts of kindness, you behave, all the things all the behaviors and choices that you make. If the mundane fuels goodness, then that elevates it. You're taking parchment and turning it into tefillin, that elevates it. Using a candle to light Shabbos candles, to make a blessing on food. All these things that's using your time, space, using your income, part of your income for charity and for building institutions of Torah. That's elevation. That's a part of elevation. Taking the mundane and making it a source and a partner to something holy and godly. The idea of breaking something is it has to lose its identity. And it has to lose its identity means it can't exist as an entity anymore. That's the nisayon. The only way for it to find its elevation is by losing its identity. Pharaoh, you can't turn Pharaoh around. Pharaoh has to be broken. There's certain things that the only way to bring out their spark is that they have to lose their identity. And the challenge, the avoda part of it is that whether the challenge is for you yourself, right? The person who doesn't eat non-kosher, right? You didn't eat the non-kosher food, but by not eating the non-kosher food and avoiding it and saying this is not for me, that breaks the non-kosher food. It means it doesn't become part by not being part of your service of God. That's its way of getting its elevation. So there's different ways of breaking. Let's continue. It's a good question. The Rebbe says these two ideas of elevation and breaking we find in the plagues. First it says, "V'al Pari v'amarti, go to come to Pari and say to him, Koyamar Hashem, so said God, Shlach sami v'avduni, let my people go and let them serve me. V'mayinat l'shlayach hinim negev, and if you don't let the Jews go out, I'm going to bring a plague. Shekavonis hamakasi kidei lifol al Pari shehu yishalach b'nei Yisrael Mitzrayim. The idea was that Pari, through the plagues, should let the Jewish people leave. That's part of elevation. By Pari understanding through the plague that he needs to let the Jewish people go, he listens, he becomes a force of help. And that elevates Egypt. The second part is when Pari's heart is hardened, and by coming to Pari, you're not going to affect change. In order to break him, and he should see the miracles and tell the stories. He should see the miracles that happened in Egypt and tell them over for the next generations. What's that idea? That's the breaking. By Pari getting it, that their way is not the way. We're not asking you permission, because God hardened his heart. So what's the point of asking him? The idea is Pari needs to be broken. There has to be a shvira in order to break the powers of the forces of impurity. Let's continue at the end of the paragraph to finish off. And after you break Egypt and elevate Egypt, then you could leave Egypt. You have no reason to be there anymore. We're not in Egypt. There's no purpose in being in Egypt. Egypt has a mission. It's an avodah. Like I said before, the Rebbes said before, the idea is to get to the land. But we needed to go through the exercise of engaging and dealing with Egypt in order to be able to be worthy of the land of plenty. We no longer have any connection to the forces that are opposite to holiness, because it on its own is not an entity. There's no purpose on its own. Its only purpose is the exercise involved, whether you're going to change it or whether you're going to break it. But there's no purpose of it on its own. Because Egypt just sits there and tries to make things difficult for the Jewish people and for what our void is. After the enemy loses his identity, now we're ready to go out of Egypt, because there's no more the forces that are holding us back. Go to the land of plenty. The opposite of what Egypt is trying to affect on the Jewish people. It's a shame we can't get to the end of the talk. The Rebbes takes the experience of Egypt as a location to an experience of Egypt in our life. All this happens in our own life. There's the Egypt in our own life. There's the restrictions that we have initially in our life, the Mitzrayim, all these limitations, all these forces of negativity, all this, whether it's negative energy, negative attitude, struggling with temptation, etc. Once you get out of those limitations, then you can go to the land of plenty. You can't go to the land of plenty without leaving Egypt. And that's the experience. These are the experiences that we're living through in our own life. Therefore, Mitzrayim is happening now. It's not a story that happened only then. We say every day, every generation, you have to view like you left Egypt, because every person goes through these experiences. So therefore he says, only then you can go to the land of plenty. That your place, the same place that was a place of limitations and restrictions and impurity, becomes a place of plenty. A resting place for God. The Rebbe continues this talk. We're going to stop here. The Rebbe continues this talk with the idea of Machta Eretz Yisrael, that our job is to make every space that you are, the land of Israel, every experience you have is this experience of turning the Egypt within you, within your experiences. Every experience, and that's why I believe, hold on, Barbara, that's why I believe that he's going to answer. I just wanted to get to see if he answers the reason why we have the leaving of the coming to Eretz Yisrael in the beginning is because it's all part of the story. I believe that's what the Rebbe's conclusion is. It's all part of the story. The story is not just that we had an experience for 210 years, 430 years in Egypt, and now we left that, now we've gone to new experiences. We're talking about entering the land where as soon as we leave Egypt, because that's all part of it. You can't enter the land without experience in Egypt, without dealing with Egypt. You can, like the Alter Rebbe says, you can't. You have to go back to where you lost God. You can't find God in the place where you didn't lose him. If you lost God somewhere, you have to find him in that same place. Yeah, you can't try to run away from where the troubles are to find the land of plenty. The land of plenty is right there where Egypt is. You just have to go through the experiences of it. Yes, Barbara.
I was just wondering if you could send the date of this Sichos via WhatsApp and in English so that it could be read.
Say that again.
Could you send the date of this Sichos by the Rebbe via WhatsApp and an English translation so I could read it?
Yeah, I'll upload on the group the English. I think this one 1991 is already translated in English. Yes, Aaron, I'll upload that after the class.
This what the part you're not going through because of time, is it something that you go through part of our Monday schmooze?
If it's allowed for it, people like to ask questions, but if we have time, we'll try to get to that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining, and as always, it's been a pleasure. And Chodesh Tov. Tonight we're Matzah Rosh Chodesh, and Shavua Tov. See you next week.